You built something. Revenue is up. The margins are real. The bank account reflects actual work that actually happened. And then you decide it is time to sell, and you find out, quietly, then loudly, that no one will buy it. Not at the number you need. Not on terms that make sense. Not in any way that resembles the exit you spent 3 years assuming was waiting for you on the other side of the work. This is not a rare story. It happens to owners who did everything right by the operational definition of right. They grew the top line, they kept customers, they stayed profitable through years that punished less careful operators. And still, when they go to market, the serious buyers do not appear. The letters of intent come in at 40% of the asking price with conditions attached. The SBA lender declines. The private equity group passes after the second call. The broker stops returning emails with the same urgency they had before the listing went live. What is happening is not a market timing problem. It is a structural problem. And it was baked in years before the owner ever thought about leaving. Here is the scenario exactly. You own a service business. It generates $780,000 in revenue annually. EBITDA sits at $190,000. You have been running it for 7 years. You know every client by name. You know which ones call after hours. You know which vendor will deliver on a Tuesday with 48 hours notice and which one needs a week and a half. The business is real. The cash flow is real. You put the business on the market expecting a multiple somewhere between 3 and 5 times earnings. You expect to walk away with somewhere north of $700,000. What you receive is silence, then skepticism, then a conversation that reframes everything. A buyer surfaces. He is not the buyer you imagined. He is careful and analytical, and he asks questions you have never been asked about your own company. He asks who handles client relationships when you are out of the office. You tell him that you handle them. He asks who would handle them after the transaction closes. The call gets quiet for a moment. He asks for 3 years of financial statements. Your bookkeeper pulls them together and they are accurate, but they are not clean. Owner compensation is inconsistently categorized. Some personal expenses run through the business in ways that were never a problem when it was just you reading them. He asks for a customer concentration report. Your top 3 clients represent 61% of revenue. He thanks you for your time. This is the hidden mismatch. Owners value what they built. Buyers value what they can operate without the person who built it. Owners see the revenue. Buyers see the risk profile underneath the revenue. And the gap between those two views does not get resolved at the negotiating table. It gets resolved, or it does not, in the years before the table exists. Because a buyer cannot finance what a lender will not underwrite. And a lender will not underwrite a business where the EBITDA is contingent on the continued presence of the seller. The SBA looks at cash flow coverage. It looks at management depth. It looks at whether the business has systems or whether it has a person running on institutional memory and relationships that are not transferable by contract. When those things are absent, the financing falls apart. And when the financing falls apart, the only tools left on the table are seller financing and earnouts. Not as negotiating chips, as requirements. As the only architecture under which any deal happens at all. Seller financing means you do not get paid at closing. You become the bank. You carry a note for 2 or 3 years and hope the new operator runs the business well enough to service the debt you are owed. An earnout means a portion of your purchase price is contingent on revenue or profit targets that you no longer control because you no longer own the company. These structures are not inherently bad, but when they become the only path forward, when they are not options but conditions, it tells you something precise about the perceived risk of the asset you are selling. Buyers and lenders are agreeing with each other that the business is worth less in someone else's hands than it is in yours. They may be right. This is the operator dependence trap. The business is not a business in the transferable sense. It is a job with overhead. The owner is not a stakeholder in a system. The owner is the system. The revenue follows the owner's relationships. The quality depends on the owner's judgment applied in real time. The vendor terms exist because of the owner's personal history with the vendor. None of this is documented. None of it is trainable. None of it survives the handoff. A buyer who writes a check for that business is not acquiring an asset. They are paying for a tutorial and then being left alone in the building. The owners who end up here are not failures. They are, in most cases, genuinely skilled operators who spent every available unit of attention making the business work and none of it making the business legible to someone who might someday want to own it. Those are 2 different activities. Almost no one tells you that while you are still early enough to act on it. Exitability is not a feature you add at the end. It is a structural property you either build in or you discover you are missing when it is expensive to discover it. The decision to be acquirable is made years before you want to be acquired. The documentation, the management depth, the clean financials, the customer diversification, the systems that run without your specific presence, those things take time to construct and they cannot be reconstructed in the 6 months before you go to market without a buyer noticing the fresh paint. What follows this is a diagnostic. There are 3 blockers that explain almost every failed or discounted exit. The first is financial quality, meaning whether your numbers are clean, consistent, and credible to a lender. The second is operational transferability, meaning whether the business can be handed to someone who is not you and continue performing. The third is marketability, meaning whether the right buyers can find the business and understand it quickly enough to stay interested. Each one is fixable. None of them is fast. The place to start is understanding which one is your actual problem, because treating the wrong blocker first is how owners spend 2 years improving things that were never the issue. The first thing a buyer does with your financials is not read them. It is stress test them. They are looking for the number underneath the number. The EBITDA you present is a starting point. What they are trying to find is the EBITDA that would survive scrutiny from an SBA lender, a quality of earnings report, and a due diligence team that gets paid to find problems. In most small business transactions, those 2 numbers are not the same. The distance between them is where deals die. Start with the books. Messy financials are not just an inconvenience, they are a signal. When a buyer sees 3 years of statements where owner compensation shifts categories annually, where personal vehicle expenses run through the operating account, where a family member on payroll carries a title that does not correspond to any documented function, they do not see a sloppy bookkeeper. They see a business where the reported earnings are not real earnings. Every add-back you present, every adjustment you make to normalize the EBITDA requires the buyer to trust your characterization of your own numbers. Some add-backs are legitimate. Owners pay themselves above market salaries. That is standard and adjustable. But when the add-back schedule runs to 11 line items and 3 of them require a detailed explanation to make sense, the lender starts discounting the whole figure. Not the suspicious items, the whole figure, because credibility is not itemized. You lose it in aggregate. Then there is customer concentration. Your top 3 clients represent 61% of revenue. That number, presented to an SBA lender or a private equity group, generates an immediate question. What happens if one of them leaves in year 2? The buyer is not being pessimistic. They are underwriting a loan or deploying capital that has to survive a scenario where your best client gets acquired, changes purchasing leadership, or simply finds a competitor who calls them first. If 20% of your revenue walks out one door, the debt service coverage ratio breaks. The lender knows this. They model it, and if the model shows the business going underwater on a single client departure, the financing does not get approved. The buyer who wanted to pay you 5 times earnings now needs the structure to reflect the risk that the lender just declined to absorb. Margin pressure compounds this. A business that generated $190,000 in EBITDA 3 years ago but is generating $147,000 today because wages went up, because a key supplier repriced, because you cannot raise rates on clients who have been with you since the beginning. That business does not get valued on the historical number. It gets valued on the current number and the trend. Buyers do not average, they extrapolate. A margin that has compressed 18% over 3 years is a margin that will compress further after the transaction closes, when the institutional knowledge leaves and the new operator is still learning the vendor relationships and the client preferences and the 100 small things that you handle without thinking. The underwriter sees a cash flow that is declining and a cost structure that is not. That is not a business they will finance at the multiple you need. Capital expenditures tell their own story. If the equipment is aging, if a delivery vehicle needs replacing in year 2, if the HVAC in the production space was flagged in the inspection, those are not line items the buyer absorbs quietly. They reduce the true free cash flow. A business showing $190,000 in EBITDA but requiring $60,000 in deferred capital expenditures over the next 24 months is a business with a real earnings profile closer to $160,000 on an annualized basis. Working capital surprises do the same thing. If the business runs on net 60 receivables and the buyer needs to fund 2 months of operations before the first customer payment arrives, that is a capital requirement that comes out of the purchase price in negotiation or comes out of the buyer's reserves after closing. Either way, it changes the math. Deal structure creates its own ceiling on who can buy. A business that requires 90% leverage to acquire, that demands a personal guarantee from the buyer, that carries a balloon payment in year 3, does not get purchased by the most capable operators in the market. It gets purchased by the ones who have no other option or who have not done this before. High leverage with a short maturity means the buyer is spending the first 2 years focused entirely on debt service, not on growth, not on retention, not on the operational improvements that would make the business more valuable over time. You do not want that buyer. That buyer is likely to call you in month 19 with a problem that is now also your problem if you are carrying a seller note. Licensing and regulatory transfer risk stops deals quietly and often late. A business that operates under a license tied to the owner's individual credentials, a contractor's license, a professional certification, a state permit that requires reapplication under new ownership, carries a closing risk that most buyers discover in due diligence rather than before the letter of intent. By then, weeks or months have been spent, attorneys have billed. The buyer has walked away from other opportunities. When the transfer risk surfaces, the deal either collapses or restructures around an extended transition that the seller did not plan for and the buyer did not want. And then there is the valuation itself. The online multiple calculators and the broker comps do not know your customer concentration. They do not know that your margin is compressing. They do not know that 3 of your 11 add-backs are going to be challenged in a quality of earnings report. They return a number that reflects an idealized version of a business in your industry. Your business is not idealized. No business is. The gap between the number you arrived at using a comp and the number a buyer arrives at after 2 weeks of due diligence is not a negotiating gap. It is a reality gap, and it does not close by holding firm. It closes, when it closes at all, by addressing the underlying conditions that created it. The buyers are not wrong. The lenders are not wrong. They are reading the same business you built. They are just reading it from the outside. The financials are one layer. Underneath them is the operating reality. And the operating reality is where most small business sales quietly stop moving. A buyer finishes the quality of earnings report. The numbers survive roughly. The concentration is manageable roughly. They move to the next question, which is always the same question rephrased in different ways. What happens when you leave? Who catches what you catch? Who knows what you know? Who handles the client who calls at 7 p.m. because a shipment is wrong and the job starts at 6 a.m.? If the honest answer is you, the deal is already in trouble. Not because the buyer is unsophisticated, because the buyer is doing the math on what they are actually purchasing, and what they are purchasing is a business that functions as an extension of one person's capacity, relationships, and institutional memory. That is not a business. That is a job with overhead. And no one finances a job at 4 times earnings. Key person risk is the most common choke point and the least fixed. You are the sales engine. You are the estimator. You are the one the foreman calls when the job goes sideways and the one the long-term client expects to hear from when something matters. You absorbed these functions gradually, across years, because you were good at them and because hiring someone to do them felt expensive and uncertain. That logic was correct for building the business. It is fatal for transferring it. The buyer is not buying your capability. They cannot buy that. They are buying a system that operates without your capability present. If that system does not exist, there is no transferable asset at the multiple you need. Underneath the key person problem is the bench problem, or rather the absence of one. Most small businesses have people who do the work and an owner who directs, coordinates, and fills every gap between the two. The middle layer, experienced managers with clear authority, documented accountability, and the institutional standing to lead after the owner leaves, is thin or missing entirely. A buyer looking at your org chart is not evaluating your team's loyalty or their years of service. They are evaluating whether someone in that organization can run a Monday morning meeting, handle a vendor dispute, and make a pricing decision without calling you first. If the answer is no, the transition period they require gets longer, the earnout structure gets larger, and the purchase price adjusts to reflect the risk that without you present, the organization loses cohesion before the new owner finds their footing. Then there is the knowledge that lives nowhere except inside you. The pricing logic that accounts for job-specific variables you have learned to read in a 5-minute walkthrough. The vendor relationships where the rep calls your cell and extends terms because of a decade of history that no contract documents. The service delivery sequence your best technician follows not because it is written anywhere but because you trained them the same way 3 times and they watched you do it twice before that. The client preferences, the billing sensitivities, the reason certain accounts require a particular touch that no one else on your team has ever had to apply because you always handled it yourself. None of this is transferable because none of it is written. A buyer cannot acquire what is not recorded. A lender cannot underwrite what disappears when the owner does. Revenue tied to personal relationships rather than documented retention systems is the same problem from the revenue side. Your client did not sign a contract with your company. They agreed to work with you. Your referral network sends business because of who you are in the local market, not because of a brand or a system or a follow-up process that operates whether or not you are in the building. The buyer inherits the accounts on paper. Whether they inherit the actual relationships depends entirely on how transferable those relationships are, and in most cases that question is not answered until after the transaction closes, which is exactly when you no longer have leverage and the buyer no longer has certainty. The systems underneath the operations confirm all of this to any buyer who looks carefully. A CRM that you stopped updating 2 years ago because you already know the clients. Scheduling that runs through a shared calendar and your memory. Inventory tracked in a spreadsheet that only one person knows how to interpret. Reporting that happens whenever someone asks, rather than on a cadence the business generates automatically. These are not signs of a lean operation. They are signs of a business where the infrastructure investment has been consistently deferred in favor of the owner's time and the owner's judgment. Buyers in today's market, particularly those who have operated or acquired other businesses before, arrive with expectations about systems because they know what absence of systems costs them in the first 18 months of ownership. Retention risk compounds the picture. Staff who stay because of their relationship with you, who have never been given a career path, whose compensation has not kept pace because the budget always had other priorities, who leave if the culture changes even slightly, those are not stable employees from a buyer's perspective. They are contingent ones. And the risk that 2 or 3 key people depart in the 6 months following a sale is priced into every thoughtful offer you will receive. Founder fatigue makes all of this worse because it tends to arrive precisely when you need the business to look its best. The years when you were thinking about an exit were also years when reinvesting in documentation, systems, and management felt like work that would benefit someone else more than it would benefit you. So the investment did not happen. The SOPs did not get written. The middle manager did not get hired and developed. The CRM did not get cleaned up. And now the business you are presenting to buyers is the version that reflects 5 years of deferred attention during the period when your energy was already diminishing. The buyer reads all of this, not always explicitly. Sometimes just as a feeling that something is not quite right, that the business runs on too many unwritten agreements and too much of one person's presence. That feeling does not stay unexamined. It turns into questions. The questions become conditions. The conditions become price adjustments. And eventually the deal either restructures around the risk or stops moving entirely. None of this is permanent. All of it is buildable. But it has to be built before the sale begins, not during it. None of it is permanent. That sentence is worth carrying forward because the rest of this is about what you do with it. You start with an exitability audit. Not a formal engagement, not a banker yet, not a broker on commission. You sit down with your own business and you run a quality of earnings cleanup on yourself before anyone else does it. You pull 3 years of financials and you build an honest add-back schedule. You identify every personal expense running through the business, every one-time cost, every owner compensation adjustment that a buyer will need to normalize. You do this before it gets done to you, because when it gets done to you, you are not in control of the narrative. When you do it yourself, you are. Alongside that, you build a risk map. Customer concentration, key person dependency, undocumented processes, vendor relationships that exist in a cell phone contact list and nowhere else. You write it all down, not to be punished by the list, but because a risk you have named is a risk you can work on. A buyer financeable earnings story is not a fabrication. It is the truth, presented with context, add-backs that hold scrutiny, and a forward revenue picture that connects to documented retention and contracted revenue. That story either exists or it gets built. You are building it. De-risking the revenue comes next. If your top 3 customers represent 60% of your revenue, that number has to move before the number on your offer letter will. New customer acquisition is part of it, but so is formalizing what you already have. Contracts that renew automatically, service agreements with actual terms and defined scope. A follow-up system that runs whether or not you are in the building that week. Pricing that reflects the value you deliver rather than the rates you set 6 years ago and have been uncomfortable adjusting ever since. Retention is not just a metric. It is a signal to a buyer that revenue will still be there after you leave. If your best customers buy from you because they trust you personally, you need to begin the transfer of that trust to your business as a brand, your team as the relationship, and your process as the reason they stay. The transferable organization is the hardest part and the part most owners delay longest, which is exactly why it creates the most value when it finally gets built. You need a general manager or someone in that function, a person who runs the Monday meeting, handles the vendor call, makes the scheduling decision, and is not waiting for your input to proceed. This may be someone you hire from outside. It may be someone already in the building who has been ready for more authority for 2 years and never received it because you were always there to fill the gap. Either way, you define the role, you transfer real accountability into it, and you begin removing yourself from the decisions that should belong to it. You also document, not everything at once. Start with the 10 processes that would stop or slow without you. Write them down at the level of detail where someone competent but new could follow them. CEFs are not bureaucracy. They are proof that the business is a system, not a dependency. KPIs get defined and reported on a cadence that the business generates, not on a cadence driven by your attention. A buyer needs to believe the organization has a nervous system that operates independently. SOPs and KPIs are how you show them that it does. Financial credibility has a specific texture that buyers and their lenders recognize immediately. Monthly close discipline means your books close within 10 business days every month without exception. Clean add-backs means every personal expense is properly categorized and explainable in 30 seconds, not 30 minutes of defensive archaeology. Forward-looking reporting means you have a budget, a forecast, and actuals tracked against both. Most small businesses report what happened. A business preparing for a transaction shows what it expects to happen and why, and then shows that it was roughly right the last 3 times it made the prediction. That is not sophisticated accounting. That is basic credibility, and most of the businesses sitting across the table from a buyer do not have it. Your exit is not one path. The strategic sale to a competitor or adjacent operator is one option. The sponsor sale to a private equity group looking for a platform or add-on is another, and that buyer often tolerates more risk than a strategic will, provided the EBITDA is large enough and the management layer is visible. A management buyout is possible if you have built the right person into the right role and can structure the financing to make it work. A partial recapitalization, where you sell a majority stake and retain equity, lets you take some chips off the table now while continuing to participate in value creation over the next 3 to 5 years. Each path has different requirements and different timelines. The point is that a business rebuilt for transferability does not have to choose one path in advance. It earns the right to consider all of them. The timeline is 12 to 36 months of intentional work. Not passive ownership, not maintenance mode, intentional, documented improvement against specific milestones. Revenue concentration below 20% for the top customer. A GM operating independently for at least 1 full quarter. Financials closing clean for 12 consecutive months. 1 or 2 new contracted revenue streams. These are not aspirational. They are the criteria a buyer uses to justify a full multiple. Here's the one thing to do this week. Identify the single biggest reason a buyer would reduce their offer or walk away. Name it precisely, assign a number to it if you can. Begin working on it before anything else, because optionality is not something you find when you need an exit. It is something you build before you need one. The businesses that sell well are not the ones that listed at the right time. They are the ones that were ready when the right buyer arrived.